What I'd like to see, Canada become our 51st state.
Well, look, I have a great relationship with Canada. They're very tough traders, but I have a very good relationship with the Prime Minister and with Canada.
You had said you would halt those negotiations earlier after the tariff.
Well, I have halted them.
And so will you restart that?
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, the problem is Canada makes a lot of things that we don't need because we make them also.
Canada is angry, not mildly irritated, not quietly disappointed, but genuinely, openly, unmistakably angry. And what surprises Washington most is that this anger isn't weakening Canada, it's hardening it, it's clarifying it, and it's beginning to corner Donald Trump at the exact moment he thought he had all the leverage. This is the story of an unexpected shift in North America, how a furious Canadian public, a recalibrated government, and months of escalating U.S. pressure have combined into a moment the United States can no longer brush aside. It started with a simple question circulating across newsrooms, polls, and online debates. How pissed off are Canadians at Trump and the U.S. right now? The answer, it turns out, is extremely, and with good reason. Over the past year, Canada has taken hit after hit from Washington. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, and critical minerals. Accusations over digital policies. Public threats of more penalties after Ontario Premier Doug Ford aired an ad quoting Ronald Reagan on the dangers of protectionism, an ad that somehow managed to infuriate the President of the United States. And hovering over everything is the looming possibility that Trump may walk away from the USMCA just weeks before the trade deal heads into its mandatory January review. Then came the 51st-State joke, Trump's favorite jab, revived again in early fall. Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, ended that quickly with one of the cleanest diplomatic shutdowns in recent memory. "I've consulted the owners. They're not interested." The moment landed like a national sigh of relief. Finally, someone had said it plainly. Amid all this tension, something deeper has been shifting. Canadians aren't just upset, they're reevaluating the entire relationship with the United States. And in doing so, they're giving their government a rare gift, the political space to push back. For decades, Canadian frustration with American politics came and went in cycles, usually polite, usually short-lived. Not this time. Today, frustration has hardened into a durable sentiment that the U.S., under Donald Trump, is no longer a reliable partner. Travel to the U.S. from Canada has dropped noticeably. Conversations in business circles, universities, and town halls have taken on a new tone, one that blends disappointment with resolve. This shift matters because it changes the political landscape in Ottawa. A Canadian Prime Minister no longer risks backlash for standing firm against Washington. In fact, the opposite is true. Canadians expect their leaders to draw lines. Trump did not just irritate voters, he awakened their sense of national self-respect. This is the part Washington overlooked. Trump may love the theater of announcing tariffs or threatening to rip up trade agreements, but behind the theatrics lies a basic reality. The United States needs Canada far more than his rhetoric suggests. The U.S. relies on Canadian heavy crude that American refineries are specifically tuned to process. Almost 500,000 American farmers depend on the fertilizers shipped south from Saskatchewan. The country's nuclear plans hinge on supply chains now dominated by Canadian-backed companies. And when it comes to critical minerals, the resources that will define the next generation of industry, Canada is one of the few democratic nations with reserves large enough to match rising demand. So, while Trump raises tariffs, Canada's essential role doesn't disappear, it becomes more obvious. Even in the sectors hit hardest by U.S. measures, Canadian exports have not collapsed, they have adjusted. In some cases, global demand has even strengthened Canada's position. The anger that once reflected vulnerability now reflects confidence. Trump wanted Canada on its heels. Instead, Canada is discovering how much leverage it actually has. Tariffs make for strong campaign lines, especially in Trump's political universe. The problem is that they also reshape supply chains, raise costs, and disrupt production, especially in industries as deeply integrated as autos, construction, and energy. American manufacturers are already reporting higher input costs. Some are warning that they may not survive another year of unpredictable tariff policy. And the irony is, these are the very companies Trump promised to protect. Canada, meanwhile, continues trading, diversifying, and adapting. Without firing a shot, it is outmaneuvering an American strategy that relies more on drama than detail. It's the quietest checkmate imaginable, the kind Trump never notices until it's on the board. Mark Carney walked into office earlier this year with a message that startled many. The old relationship with the United States is over. Not the friendship, not the security partnership, but the era of automatic alignment gone. And he acted accordingly. Under Carney, Canada has moved with unusual speed to open new markets, strengthen ties with Asia, expand partnerships for energy, nuclear technology, and advanced manufacturing, and reinvest heavily in national defense and critical infrastructure. All of this sends one message to Washington. Canada is no longer treating the United States as an anchor. It is treating it as one partner among many. And Canadians approve. For once, public sentiment and federal strategy are moving in the same direction. Trump assumed Canada would blink. Instead, Canada is staring back. He assumed tariffs would force concessions. Instead, they revealed how vulnerable American supply chains are without Canada. He assumed Canadians would eventually back down. Instead, the backlash is now shaping national policy. And perhaps most surprising to the White House, when Trump threatened new tariffs after Ford's Reagan ad, he never followed through. The threat fizzled. Ottawa didn't cave, and everyone watching noticed exactly who blinked first. As the USMCA review approaches, Trump now faces a Canada that is confident, cohesive, and backed by a public no longer willing to be treated as an afterthought. So, how angry are Canadians? Angry enough to stop assuming the United States will behave like an ally. Angry enough to demand a new footing in the relationship. Angry enough to accelerate a diversification strategy that weakens U.S. leverage. And angry enough to walk into USMCA 2026 ready for a fair negotiation, or a tough one if that's what Washington chooses. The real story isn't the anger itself. The real story is what the anger has produced. A Canada that is more self-assured, more strategic, and more willing to assert its place in North America. And as Trump prepares for a make-or-break trade review in January, he now faces a question he didn't expect. What happens when a once polite Canada finally calls his bluff and has the unity, the leverage, and the strategy to win the confrontation he started?
Ground has officially been broken on Volkswagen's PowerCo electric vehicle battery gigafactory in St. Thomas.
This is the world's largest automaker. They don't do a plan for just this year while Donald Trump's got tariffs. They're doing a plan looking forward.
Canada just scored a win that cuts through all the noise of the North American trade war. While Donald Trump doubles down on tariffs, emergency orders, and political theatrics, the world's largest automaker quietly made its choice, and it wasn't the United States. Volkswagen broke ground on its PowerCo EV battery gigafactory in St. Thomas, Ontario, the largest facility of its kind in Canadian history. And in a moment that should make Washington pause, a local official said the part no one in the U.S. wants to admit. This is the world's largest automaker. They don't make a plan for just this year while Donald Trump's got tariffs. They're making a plan looking forward. That single sentence captures the entire story tonight. Canada is the long-term bet. Trump's America is the short-term gamble.
The milestone kicks off development of 3 major buildings at the site, making it the largest facility of its kind in the country. with full production expected to begin in 2027. The facility is set to create up to 3,000 direct jobs, while protecting Ontario's auto manufacturing supply chain amidst the trade war.
Volkswagen's PowerCo has officially moved into full construction, marking the start of a multi-year industrial transformation for southwestern Ontario. The St. Thomas site is now home to 3 major buildings rising out of the ground, with full EV battery production set for 2027. The project promises around 3,000 direct jobs and thousands more across suppliers and the regional economy. For a community long tied to the ups and downs of the auto sector, this investment feels like a turning point, not just for employment, but for identity. Mayor Joe Preston described the factory as generational change that would allow families to stay, work, buy homes, and build a vibrant future without being forced to leave in search of opportunity. Yet the celebration comes with a message aimed well beyond Ontario. Volkswagen chose Canada at a moment when the United States is entering its most unpredictable trade cycle in years. Trump's new tariff regime has introduced a level of uncertainty that multinational companies simply cannot build billion-dollar strategies around. In contrast, Canada is executing a long-term industrial plan with clarity, consistency, and political alignment. And the timing is crucial. As global automakers race to secure stable access to batteries and minerals, any country offering predictability becomes a magnet for investment. Canada stepped into that role decisively. The groundwork now being poured in St. Thomas signals not only the rise of a factory, but the emergence of a national manufacturing strategy finally aligned with global demand. Companies do not fear high taxes or strict regulations as much as they fear unpredictability. And that unpredictability now defines U.S. trade policy under Donald Trump. His administration has imposed sweeping tariffs under IEEPA and Section 232, triggering retaliatory threats, court challenges, and mounting frustration from manufacturers. Reuters and Bloomberg both describe Trump's tariff landscape as one of the biggest business risks in North America today. Volkswagen saw all of this and walked the other way. It did not want a political gamble. It wanted a predictable, rules-based environment, and it found that in Canada. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada is presenting itself as a country that plans for decades, not for election cycles. Ottawa is building full EV supply chains from minerals to manufacturing, offering long-term investment credits, securing international partnerships, and pushing to double non-U.S. exports within 10 years. Volkswagen doesn't choose sites based on short-term headlines. It chooses based on energy stability, predictable climate policy, critical mineral access, and workforce reliability. Canada met every requirement. The United States, under Trump's tariff-driven strategy, did not. The calculation was simple. Canada is the safer investment, Canada is the smarter investment, and Canada is the forward-looking investment. Trump's goal was to force manufacturing back onto U.S. soil, but the outcome has been the opposite. By destabilizing cross-border supply chains and raising import costs unpredictably, Trump made the U.S. a riskier place to build long-term industrial projects. Volkswagen responded exactly how a global automaker would. It chose the country with stability, critical minerals, clean electricity, and a government capable of delivering consistent industrial policy. Even the messaging from Ontario officials reinforced this reality. Volkswagen is planning beyond Trump, meaning the company sees the U.S. as too erratic to anchor a generational project. Canada, meanwhile, offers continuity regardless of political turbulence. This is why analysts describe Canada's EV build-out as one of the most strategically coherent industrial pivots in the Western Hemisphere. While the United States spends political energy on tariff battles, Canada is quietly constructing a continent-wide supply chain, stretching from mining towns to battery campuses to export-ready auto plants. The Volkswagen deal is not an outlier. It is a preview of where the industry is moving next. This decision also fits into a broader shift across the world. The U.S. is facing a surge of corporate lawsuits over Trump's emergency tariffs. Mexico has warned of reassessing its own manufacturing strategy. Europe is preparing retaliatory measures if U.S. tariff escalations continue. China's rare earth leverage remains a looming pressure point despite the temporary truce negotiated at APEC 2025. Canada, however, is moving in the opposite direction, building stability, broadening trade ties in Asia, and offering companies like Volkswagen a future insulated from Washington's political storms. The St. Thomas Gigafactory is not an isolated win. It is the industrial expression of a country repositioning itself for a more multipolar economic world. For Canada, this project is a declaration of industrial confidence. It signals that the country can win global-scale factories, build complete EV ecosystems, and compete directly with the United States. It strengthens local economies, secures high-quality employment, and anchors Canada firmly in the clean technology manufacturing race. More importantly, it proves something Canadians often forget. When the world looks for reliability, it looks north. For the U.S., the implications are significant. Tariff chaos does not attract investment. Consistency does. Volkswagen's choice demonstrates that Trump's protectionist strategy is not reshoring industry, it is pushing it away. The U.S. had every structural advantage: larger markets, larger workforces, aggressive incentive programs, and political pressure on automakers to stay domestic. Yet when Volkswagen had to place a once-in-a-generation investment, it chose Canada. It should not be a mystery why. Companies can manage competition, they cannot manage chaos. The groundbreaking in St. Thomas is more than a milestone for Canada's EV future. It is a moment of clarity for North America. Volkswagen made its choice, and in doing so, revealed the deeper truth shaping global industry. The future belongs to the country that can think beyond the next press conference. Canada is offering stability, clean energy, long-term planning, and a government aligned behind a coherent industrial strategy. Trump's America is offering unpredictability, tariff shockwaves, and policies that shift faster than companies can build factories. Volkswagen saw the difference. The world sees it too. And if more companies follow the same logic, Canada will not just keep pace, it will lead. Canada just delivered one of the clearest signs yet that the era of quiet deference to Washington is over. After a high-level virtual meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney, Ontario Premier Doug Ford stepped in front of reporters and delivered a message that captured the country's new direction with stunning clarity.
I want to thank the Prime Minister for traveling around the world and getting Canada out front and making sure that we diversify our trade with other countries.
It wasn't a throwaway line. It was an unmistakable signal that even Ontario, the province most economically tied to the United States and usually the most cautious in moments of Canada-US tension, is now fully aligned with Carney's global pivot. At a time when Donald Trump's administration is imposing sweeping tariffs, freezing communication channels, and trying to pull allies back under American control, Ford's remarks confirmed something Washington hoped wasn't true. Canada is no longer waiting for the United States. It is rewriting its place in the world and winning partners Trump never expected Ottawa to secure. What Ford said wasn't just praise for a prime minister. It was an acknowledgement of a new Canadian strategy. Canada is stepping onto the world stage, deliberately, confidently, and independently. The remarks came on November 17, 2025, after Carney met virtually with all provincial and territorial leaders to discuss the federal budget and the state of Canada's relationship with the United States. Ford described the meeting as positive and unusually frank, noting that communication between Ottawa and Washington has all but collapsed. Negotiators are still working behind the scenes, but official dialogue remains frozen after months of tariff escalation. Ford explained that while the United States has been pushing for a sector-by-sector negotiation model, focusing on autos, steel, and softwood lumber, Canada cannot afford to sit idle waiting for an American breakthrough. Trump's administration has repeatedly leveraged tariffs as political weapons, and Reuters recently confirmed that Trump publicly declared he would not restart trade talks with Canada after Ottawa's economic messaging campaign frustrated his inner circle. Against that backdrop, Carney briefed the premiers on his fast-paced diplomatic push overseas. From Asia to Europe and the Middle East, Canada has reopened channels, signed new agreements, and secured investment opportunities that simply were not accessible during the previous diplomatic freeze. Ford emphasized that these efforts are not symbolic. They're reshaping where Canada sells its goods, where it sources critical minerals, and where its economic partnerships will come from in the next decade. The meeting also included updates on domestic sectors under strain, including steel and autos, which continue to absorb pressure from U.S. tariffs. Ford pressed for stronger protections and stricter quota management, arguing that Canada cannot be a dumping ground for low-cost global steel. Far more importantly, however, he highlighted the Prime Minister's broader strategy. Canada must strengthen itself at home while expanding its presence abroad. Ford's endorsement carried weight precisely because Ontario has historically been the province most intertwined with American supply chains. When a leader in that position says Canada must diversify, it reflects a major national consensus. The reality is simple. Canada can no longer afford to wait for the United States to resolve its internal chaos or clarify its trade objectives. Trump's tariff strategy has made unpredictability the new normal, and industries in Ontario have grown tired of operating in the shadow of U.S. political turbulence. Ford's remarks recognized a truth that Canadians have quietly understood for years but rarely said aloud. Canada has the talent, the resources, and the diplomatic capacity to stand on its own feet. Carney's strategy of traveling around the world is not about prestige, it is about securing alternatives so that when the United States slams a door, Canada does not stand stranded in the corridor. Trump's trade war with Canada was designed to corner Ottawa into submission. Instead, it has triggered the opposite reaction. Companies in both countries are reassessing supply chains, and in some cases, shifting operations north to avoid American volatility. Farmers and manufacturers in the Midwest, many of whom helped elect Trump, are now facing higher costs because Canadian counter-tariffs have redirected supply flows across the Pacific. Meanwhile, Canada's outreach is earning tangible results. Carney's meeting with Xi Jinping produced the first thaw in Canada-China relations since 2018. China invited Carney to Beijing for high-level talks in 2026, while Canada resumed cooperation in clean technology, tourism, and energy transition. In India, negotiations are restarting after years of political chill. Across ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific, Canada is expanding trade, defense, and energy partnerships with countries eager to reduce their own dependence on Washington. What makes this pivot so powerful is that it was forced into motion by Trump himself. Faced with unpredictable tariffs and stalled negotiations, Canada did what middle powers do when global giants falter. It built a better set of options. Traveling around the world undersells the scope of the shift. Carney is not visiting capitals for ceremonial handshakes. He is redrawing Canada's economic architecture. His strategy connects new partners in critical minerals, LNG supply, nuclear technology, AI, advanced manufacturing, and clean electricity. These are the sectors that will define global leadership for the next 30 years, and Canada is anchoring itself inside that future. The United States, meanwhile, is retreating behind tariff walls. Trump's approach relies on coercion and intimidation. Carney's relies on diversification and cooperation. One closes markets, the other opens them. For decades, U.S. policymakers assumed Canada would remain loyal by default, even when mistreated. Trump pushed that assumption past its breaking point. Ford's comments show the American miscalculation. Canada was not drifting away. It was preparing its escape route. And now that escape route is becoming the foundation of a more independent, more confident Canadian identity. Doug Ford's endorsement of Carney's global trade offensive marks a defining moment in modern Canadian politics. It signals the emergence of a unified national strategy, one that protects Canada at home while building influence abroad. Trump's tariffs were meant to weaken Canada, but they accelerated the country's most significant economic realignment in decades. The question now is how far this transformation will go. Will Canada lean even more heavily into Asia and Europe? Will Trump attempt new forms of retaliation? Or will this moment be remembered as the point when Canada finally realized that it did not need permission from Washington to shape its own future? One thing is already clear. Canada has stepped onto the world stage, and this time it's standing there on its own terms.
We are going to double our non-U.S. exports over the course of the next 10 years. We think we can do it in a much shorter period of time. That's $300 billion of additional exports. Most of that is going to come from Asia, in our view. We're laying out a path for at least $500 billion of additional investment in Canada in the next 5 years.
Canada just made one of the boldest investment moves in its modern history, a $500 billion plan tied directly to its growing partnership with ASEAN. While Washington is still threatening new tariffs, Ottawa is placing its biggest economic bet on Asia. At the ASEAN summit in Kuala Lumpur, Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't just give a speech, he unveiled a vision to transform Canada's economy for the next decade and to redefine who its real partners are. This is not a temporary reaction, it is a structural shift. Carney's message was clear. Canada will build, trade, and grow with Asia, whether Washington approves or not. And the $500 billion investment blueprint is the engine driving that transformation. The timing could not have been more symbolic. Just hours after President Trump threatened to impose another 10% tariff on Canadian goods, Carney was across the Pacific, greeting ASEAN leaders in Malaysia. At the Canada-ASEAN business reception, he presented Canada as a partner ASEAN can trust. Within days, Ottawa had sealed a free trade agreement with Indonesia, reached an understanding with Malaysia's Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim to complete a full ASEAN-Canada trade deal by 2026, and announced the start of FTA negotiations with the Philippines, whose President Marcos will chair ASEAN next year. In the space of a week, Canada had joined the core of Asia's most dynamic trade network. And for the first time in years, the story was not about how Canada reacts to U.S. tariffs, but how it leads its own trade agenda. Carney's message came with a concrete number, $500 billion in new domestic investment over the next 5 years. That money will finance the next stage of Canada's industrial rebuild. New trade corridors, port terminals, LNG export facilities, and the first commercial small modular nuclear reactors. At Ontario's Darlington site, construction is already underway. The project will produce 300 megawatts of clean power, with 80% of its supply chain sourced inside Canada, backed by $3 billion in combined federal and provincial funding. Carney described this as part of a national plan to make Canada an energy superpower. The country has the third largest oil reserves and the fourth largest LNG reserves on Earth. Shipments began earlier this year with help from Malaysia's Petronas. By 2030, Canada plans to export 50 million tons of LNG annually, doubling by 2040. The $500 billion plan also includes major upgrades to Canada's railway and port logistics, allowing goods to move from Saskatchewan's grain fields to Asian harbors in less than 2 weeks. Analysts at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce estimate these new routes could add 1% to GDP growth by 2028 if fully built. Instead of responding to U.S. tariffs with anger, Carney is using them as fuel for Canada's biggest wave of industrial investment in a generation. Behind this plan is a clear strategy: double Canada's non-U.S. exports within 10 years, adding roughly $300 billion in trade, according to the Canada-Asian Business Council. To achieve it, Ottawa is working on 3 fronts.
First, new bilateral and regional pacts across ASEAN. Second, using Canada's dual membership in the EU and the CPTPP to connect the two blocs, effectively creating a bridge between Europe and Asia. Third, attracting capital from Asia back into Canada to finance infrastructure, energy, and technology projects. Carney's line that Canada can do more than one thing at once defines this approach. The goal is not to pick sides between Washington and Asia, but to build economic leverage with both.
Trump's tariff pressure was meant to pull production into the U.S. Instead, it pushed Canada outward. The latest trade data from the Canada-ASEAN Business Council shows double-digit annual growth in two-way investment for the past decade, hitting a record $24 billion in 2024. Much of this surge came after Washington began raising import duties. Every new barrier from the White House has accelerated Canada's diversification. ASEAN investors, particularly from Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia, are now pouring money into Canadian energy, mining, and agri-food projects. What was meant to isolate Ottawa has instead made it a magnet for Asian capital. Economists at the University of Toronto note that foreign direct investment inflows from ASEAN alone jumped by 38% between 2023 and 2025, marking one of the fastest shifts in Canada's modern trade history. Businesses that once looked south are now looking west, seeking long-term certainty beyond Washington's politics. Trump's plan is backfiring. The tariffs built neither American jobs nor trust, they built Canada's independence.
This pivot is not ideological, it is practical economics. Canada owns the resources and credibility that Asia needs: secure energy, stable food supply, critical minerals, and one of the world's safest financial systems. Canadian pension funds, managing over 1.8 trillion Canadian dollars, according to Statistics Canada, are already major global infrastructure investors. By linking them with ASEAN's sovereign wealth funds, Carney is creating a two-way corridor of capital where Asian investors fund Canadian projects and Canadian funds help develop clean energy networks across Asia. His cabinet reflects that vision. Key officials come from industry and finance rather than politics, former CEOs, investment bankers, and infrastructure specialists. They treat government as a growth platform, not just an administration. In short, Carney is governing like an economist, focusing on execution, scale, and credibility, the very qualities global investors look for.
At the ASEAN summit, two different economic models faced each other. The Trump team came with threats of new duties. The Carney team came with contracts and investment plans. Canada also offered something that resonated deeply in Asia: reliability. With an 85% clean electricity grid, one of the highest in the G7, and a plan to expand it by half through nuclear and renewables, Canada stands out as both a resource power and a climate-conscious partner. For nations seeking stable, rules-based trade, that balance of energy and ethics matters. It allows Canada to play a role that neither Washington nor Beijing can easily fill: a bridge economy that combines openness with trust.
What began as a reaction to tariffs has become a long-term realignment. Canada's $500 billion plan is more than an investment program. It is a declaration of economic sovereignty. If fully realized, it could reshape North American and Asia-Pacific trade for decades. By binding ASEAN, the EU, and the CPTPP into one connected system, Ottawa is laying the foundation for a new kind of middle power leadership, one based on capital, credibility, and clean energy. Trump's economic nationalism was meant to restore U.S. leverage. Instead, it is isolating Washington and empowering its closest ally. Canada is not retaliating with noise. It is responding with vision. Trump built walls. Carney is building corridors. And as those corridors begin to carry Canadian energy, technology, and capital across the Pacific, the balance of power in North America and beyond may never look the same again.